So today we are working on lesson 4 from assignment 4 in Schoology. We're working on the Photoshop retouching lesson, and we're going to go ahead and take this image of a window and improve it in a lot of different ways. The first thing I'm going to notice is that obviously I've got these weird white pixels that I no longer need on the outside of my window. And so what I want to do is I want to eliminate those by cropping down my photo. So if I look on the far left-hand side of my screen, I'm on my tools. If I go to the 5th tool down, that is my crop tool. Now, once I'm in my crop tool, I've got some options. So you'll notice that my photo is slanted. So I go over here, I'm in my crop tool, and if I hang out over here on the corner, I get these kind of curvy double-sided arrows. And if I click and I can drag my photo to rotate it so that it's a little bit more straight up and down and a more traditional kind of view of the photo. Then I can also use things like the corner to scale my crop field up and down, or I can go on the specific side top or the side, and I can bring it in a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in the side over here and try and make it kind of match up a little bit more on the side over there with how much of the window is showing. So I'm actually going to cut off a little bit of the photo just to make this look a little bit more pleasant. So once I think I've got this in a pretty good space, I can go ahead and I can hit return. And now it has cropped my photo down. Now I'm realizing I missed a little bit and there's still this little gap, which I don't love. So I can go in and again, I can go to my crop tool and I can just nudge that in a little bit. And that's one option. Or I've got some other options. If I hold my crop tool down, I also have my perspective crop tool. And that gives me more control where I can actually click and drag my corners the way I want. And I hit return, and that'll crop it a little more carefully. Or if I go back in my history tool, you can see how that would look from the start. So with my perspective crop, I can click on these corners, and it's sort of understanding the field that I want to crop, hit return, and it automatically does that for me. Now again, it gives me a little bit of extra, so I might go in and nudge this over a touch. Maybe nudge this one in a little bit, and we are in a pretty good place that I am happy with. The other thing you can do, keep in mind when you're cropping, right now it's not sort of an open crop. I can crop however size I want, or whatever size I want it, but I do have ratios, so I could hit 5:7 or 8:10. And that's going to show me, like, if I were going to print this as an 8:10 inch document, this would be the size I would want. So I would need to make it fit in here. Obviously, I would lose the top and bottom of this, so I don't want to do that, so I'm going to hit escape to get out of there. But there are those options for you, just so you know. So that's how I go ahead and I crop. You've got this hopefully now cropped down. If not, take a minute to rotate this and scale it down so you crop it, so it's really just the photo the way you need it. Once that's done, then we're going to move on. Now, the first thing I always do when I am going to edit a photo in Illustrator is I duplicate my layer so that I can preserve my original photo, and then I can mess with another one, and I keep my original one intact. So I'm going to go over here, and if I look down here at the bottom of my layers panel, there's this little piece of paper. It looks like a piece of paper with a folded corner. That icon is my new layer icon. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go on my photo layer, and I'm going to click and drag onto that icon, and it's going to automatically make a copy of my photo. So then I like to go into my original photo. I like to lock it and turn it off so it's there in case I need it ever. But then I click back on my copy. So I'm going to work on my copy. So any edits I make to this, I still have my original that is unedited, and therefore it's safe, and I can go back to that if I need to start out that way. So what I want to do now is I want to start to make this photo better than it already is. I want to improve the look of it. So I'm going to do that through adjustment layers. And there's a couple ways you can get to adjustment layers. Currently in Photoshop Creative Cloud, if I go up above my layers panel, it says properties, but if I click over, it says adjustments. And that gives me lots of different adjustments that I can make to my photograph. Another way I can get to that, if I can't find that for some reason, is I can go up top to where it says window, and then that gives you options. So I went to window, and then I go to adjustments, and that made mine go away because I didn't have them, but you can hit adjustments and they'll pop back up. And there are a lot of different ways that I can adjust my photo. And what I want you to start with is I want you to start with this one right here, the second one that's called levels. So you'll notice when I click over different icons, it tells you the name of them. So I click on levels, and then I'm going to get different options here. I can even make sure I can see all of my stuff. So it's going to give me my levels histogram, which is going to show me kind of the range of tones, the tonal variation of darks, midtones, and highlights in my photograph. And so if you notice, this shows my blacks, this shows my whites, this shows my medium grays. I don't really have any blacks in my photo. I don't have any whites, but I've got a lot of things that are close. So what I'm going to do actually is create better contrast by dragging the sliders up and down on the histogram to change how the darks and the lights and the midtones get represented. So I'm going to start with my blacks, and I'm just going to nudge that in a little bit to around 20. And you'll notice that that makes my darks more pronounced. I'm also going to drag my whites down to about 225, and that then re-brightens certain areas. And I can then adjust in here until I get it to the way I want it. Now, if I bring my medium tones down too much, it washes everything out. If it's too high, then it makes everything too dark. If it's right there in the middle, that's pretty good, but I might need to nudge it around a little bit until it looks clear and I can see everything in my photo. There's really no specific answer on what this should look like other than you should mess with it until it looks good. But if you make it too dark and you can't see anything, that's no good. So I'm going to encourage you to have your shadow at 24, 25, somewhere in there. This one at about 225. And then this one was at 1, and you can kind of just give it a little nudge in one direction a little bit. I'm going to go slightly down. So you can match my numbers if you want and input numbers directly, or you can manage the sliders. When you're done and you think that's good, you're going to go ahead and you are going to clip this layer, this adjustment to the layer below it. And the way you do that is there's this little icon. It's a square with an arrow pointing down, and you're going to click it. And what that means is that this adjustment is affecting only this layer below it. If I add 15 different photo layers underneath this, I might not want my levels adjustment to influence all of my different photos. I only want it to attach to this one layer right here. So by clipping it, it only messes with this one layer. So go ahead and make sure you're messing with your levels. And when you're done with that, click back in adjustments and choose a different adjustment. And there's so many different ones, and you can play with these at some point. I like to mess with hue and saturation a lot. I like to mess with brightness and contrast a lot. There's a lot of different options. I'm actually going to have you go to this one that looks like a scale right here, and that's your color balance. So we're going to click on color balance, and this changes the overall just kind of tone and the color cast of the image. If I look, it's a little blue. It's kind of got a bluish cast, and I like the blue, but it's a little too much. So I can go in here, and again, I can adjust my blues, my magentas, and my yellows. So if you think about cyan, magenta, and yellow, or blue, red, and yellow. But cyan, magenta, yellow, those are the colors that can kind of skew or that show up in printing. And you want to mess with those a little bit. So I'm going to nudge this over into the red a little bit. You'll notice if I do that, it kind of warms up my photo. Now that was too much. Now if I went too much the other way, now it feels way too cold and stark and scary. So it was right here in the middle. I'm going to nudge it slightly into the red. Maybe around 10 or something like that. Now, I did that to my midtones, right? So when it says here midtones, that changed the midtones. Now, if I went to highlights, I can adjust those separately. Or shadows, I can adjust those separately. So if I change the reds of my shadows, that has a different effect than if I did the reds of my midtones. So I'm going to keep it at midtones, adjusted my red slightly. If I go into my highlights, if I look at my light areas, those feel a little too red actually. So I'm going to go where it says magenta, and I'm going to bump those towards the green a little bit and calm that down a little bit. So again, I'm going to use my sliders to mess with my midtones and my highlights and just make this feel good. And then again, I'm going to clip it to the layer that I want below it. Now you're going to notice, because earlier I clicked on brightness and contrast and hue and saturation, I have adjustment layers even though I didn't change anything. So if I want to get rid of that, I just drag those down to the trash can and release. Drag this one down to the trash can and release. And then I'm on my color balance again and I clip it. And now it's only affecting this one layer, right? So if I turn on my original, you can see the difference between what I've done now and how my original was. And hopefully you think the new one, it's just a bit sharper, more defined. You can see details better. than my original photo. So far so good. I'm happy. The next thing I'm going to do when I'm done using my adjustments is I'm going to go ahead and further edit my photo. If I look, I like the way it looks, but I don't love this blue color all the way. I think it's a little too different from this kind of greenish blue down here, so I'm going to adjust that. And I can actually change the colors of items in Photoshop a couple different ways, and then we're going to show you that next. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and work on using my color replacement tool to revise some of the colors in my image. And this can be really great when you have an image and you like most of it, but there's one part where the color is just wrong or you want to alter something. So say, you've got a great picture of you and your friends, and one of your friends is wearing a Michigan jersey, and you just want to go ahead and give him some Ohio State colors. You can go ahead and swap those colors out in the photo and make your buddy be wearing whatever you wanted. So I'm going to go ahead and use a tool called my color replacement tool. That's going to be over here under my brush tool, which is the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th brush down, or tool down. So I'm going to click and I'm going to hold, and the third option down is my color replacement tool. And what the color replacement tool is going to do is it's going to analyze all of the pixels inside this circle with my little plus sign next to it, and it's going to analyze the color. It's going to look at the majority of the pixels. And right now, most of the pixels inside that are blue. So it's going to figure out that I want to change those to a new color. Now I've gone ahead and I picked a new color, and I can just set this to anything. Let's say I make this hot pink. Yikes. So I'm going to say I want this to be hot pink. So I'm going to go over my blue. It's going to analyze that most of my pixels are blue. I'm going to click, and I'm going to just kind of go over. Now it won't mess with the other colors because it's going to say those are different colored pixels. It knows that I want blue pixels because that's the majority of the pixels in the area. And I click and I held and I swapped down and I painted it pink. Oh, wow. That looks awful. But it worked. Now, if I had, I'm going to undo that. If I had a smaller radius by using my left bracket key next to the P key on my keyboard. So look at my keyboard, I find the P key, and next to that, to the right of it, there's a left bracket and a right bracket. And that's going to change the size of my tool. So left bracket goes smaller, right bracket goes larger. So a large bracket is going to say, yeah, most of these pixels are blue. So it's going to automatically, replace blue. But if I had a really tiny diameter to my tool, then as I'm going in, once I cross over, if I go just a little bit over, then suddenly the majority of my pixels are another color, and it's going to accidentally start coloring all this stuff, which we definitely do not want. It's going to get really hard to stay in these edges. So I'm going to encourage you to make this a larger tool size using the bracket keys, and then you can do color replacement. Now, obviously, hot pink does not look good. Let's get rid of it. So what would I want to do here? Well, I might go in and decide I want to make this blue match this blue down here. So I might go in, and if I look further down in my options, I got my tools over here, a little bit actually above color replacement. So right above it, there's this eyedropper tool. So I'm going to click on the eyedropper tool, and that's going to let me select colors. And if I click around in my image, you can see up here in my color box or over here that as if I click on something red, it's taking me into my red options. Brown, some blues. It's finding the color of whatever pixel I click on, and it's getting a color from somewhere else. So I could come and I could get a blue color from down here. And then I could go back to my color replacement tool, and I could click and replace the color up here, so that now this color matches this color. So my wall feels a little bit more unified, and it's not as distracting up here, and so I can really focus on the texture of the window and the lace and the flowers. So go ahead, use your color picker to pick a blue from these sort of slats down here, and then use your color replacement tool to change that color. Got that? All right, once that is done, now I'm going to go ahead and do a few more things to my image. I'm going to actually borrow some terminology from photography, from the photography field. And if I look over here, I've got some tools down below that come from photography. If I click on this one right here, it kind of looks like a lollipop, but that's actually meant to be a dodge tool that we use in photography. But I've got several called dodge, burn, and sponge. Dodge and burn are photography terms. They have to do with how you expose a photo. And if I go to dodge, I can use this to click on an area, And if you notice, the more I go over an area, the more I lighten that area up. Obviously, that's way too much, so I'm going to go into my history tool. I'm going to undo all of that. What I want to do, though, right now I'm dodging, and I'm noticing I'm dodging everything. But I want to dodge and lighten just the highlights to make this lace stand out a little bit more. So when I go into my dodge tool, I get some options up top. Right now, it's the range it's looking for midtones. I'm going to change that to highlights, which means the lighter part of my lace. And I'm going to make sure my exposure, I'm going to drop this. Exposure is the intensity. I'm going to drop this down to like 10%. You can use your slider, or you can manually input 10. And when I go then, I can go in and I'm going to make this a little bit small. Oh, I can't make that smaller. Oops. I'm going to go in and I can do just a little bit on my lace to lighten up the highlights on my lace. Now again, if I do this too much, it already starts to look pretty bad. So I shouldn't be doing this very often. You can see I use my dodge tool quite a bit. That went fast. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to make this smaller, and I might just do like one little pass over it. One little pass in a few spots just to make that pop out a little bit more. One or two passes would be plenty. But that's going to lighten the lighter areas to make my contrast pop out a little bit more. The burn tool, which we're not going to use today, but the burn tool would actually work the same way. If I went to shadows and I went over it, then I'm darkening it. So I can make certain areas darker. Again, that does not look good. That was not what I needed for this photo, but you might have a reason to use it later. So don't do that, but just you know how it works now. And lastly, I could go underneath and I could use the sponge tool. And the sponge tool is kind of like a watercolor painting. If I painted something and it was still wet, and then I took a dry sponge, I could suck some of the color up out of that to make it a little fainter. So I'm going to desaturate my color. Now right now it's on desaturate, and my flow is at 50%. Let's keep it there. So if I were to then go over and click over like these flowers, you can see how if I'm desaturating, I'm taking a lot of that brightness away and making this really dull. That's actually the opposite of what I want, right? Because my flower should kind of pop. So instead, I'm going to go ahead and change my mode from desaturate to saturate. I'm actually going to add some sort of saturation and some vividness to my colors right there. So I can just go over and do a few clicks, and you can see how then it brightens my flowers up a little bit. And maybe I go ahead and just do that around kind of near the top. But they're going to pop a little bit more from the shadows if I do that. And again, you have to do it in moderation and be careful not to make it too big. Too much saturation can be too much of a good thing, right? But we go out. I think that looks just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that. And those are my sort of cross-medium tools between photography and painting over into Photoshop. The last thing I want to do is I just want to do a little fine-tuning, and I'm going to do something called making an unsharpen mask. And to do that, I'm going to go up to Filter, up top. It's one of my top options, Filter. I'm going to go down to Sharpen. I'm going to use an unsharp mask. If there are areas where you think you need a little bit more definition in your artwork, an unsharpened mask is going to give that definition back and make your photo look just really clear and crisp. So I can preview. My preview box is checked, so I'm going to see in here how it's going to look. And I can scale out if I need to a little bit. And I'm just going to go ahead, and you can see that if I drag the radius of how many pixels are affected by my unsharpened mask up, it's going to go ahead, and you can see how it's sharpening my photo and really bumping up the contrast, the difference between the lights and the darks a little bit. And really what it's doing is it's finding edges and like the edge of this, I don't know, shutter. And near the edge, it's darkening the side against it. So it's keeping this light and then it's darkening the next side. And it's making everything feel more sharp and crisp. That's way too much, but it's still a little dull without. So I might just bump this up. I'm going to do something really minor. I'm going to do like 0.5 pixels. Oops, just kidding. 0.5 pixels. And that just gives it a little nudge to clarify things and make things pop a little bit more. So you can see how nudging it around changes things. Extreme contrast can be a little too much, but a lot of times in advertisements, there'll be much more extreme contrast. So somebody clearly went in with the unsharp mask and made it extreme. But again, I just want mine at 0.5. So I'm going to hit OK right there. So what I can do now, folks, is if I'm looking, I see I've got a couple different options. So here are my adjustment layers. Since I clipped them before, they're only affecting my layer copy. And then here's my original. So I can turn my layer copy off and then back on to compare it to what my original photo looked like. This is my original photo. And now here it is with all of my edits. So, you know, if I look, I feel like my old one, well, it looks good to start with. It's pretty drab. It's really washed out. It's all very blue. There's not a lot of definition. Whereas now I go in, my colors are a little bit more cohesive. I have better contrast, better definition. It just looks overall a little bit nicer. So that's going to walk you through how to use adjustments, how to use various tools and the unsharp mask to create a better, more refined photo.